Okay, here we go. A couple minutes late, sorry about that. I would like to call to order the Committee of the Whole meeting of the Kalamazoo City Commission for Monday, March 6, 2023. And I'll just make sure people know here we will have a public comment period that will occur during this meeting. We have public comment period that will also occur during our business meeting, but public comments can be made by people here in the chambers. You can call in. So just as a heads up there, the number to call if you want to make a public comment is 888-382-9556. And our first order of business is to call the roll. Clerk Borling.
Commissioner Decker.
Present.
Commissioner Hess.
Present.
Commissioner Hoffman.
Present.
Commissioner Juarez.
Present.
Commissioner Pradel.
Present.
Vice Mayor Cooney.
Present.
Mayor Anderson.
Here. Thank you, Clerk Borling. Any communications, City Manager?
None, Your Honor.
Thank you. And now we are right off into public comments. So you will have 2 minutes during this Committee of the Whole meeting, a little longer in our business meeting. At 2 minutes, please state your name, whether you live in the city. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Katie Bloom. I live in Kalamazoo. I live in the Oakland-Winchell neighborhood. I come here today because I'm part of a coalition that represents over 300 people. We have signed a petition. I just met briefly with Mayor Anderson and Councilor Jeannie Hess, and we gave them a copy of the petition regarding restoring parking access near the Asylum Lake Preserve in our neighborhood. And so I simply want it to be on the record that we've got the petition and we have turned it in for your review. Any questions?
Thank you very much. I'm going to pass this petition down to Clerk Borling, so have a copy of it.
Thank you.
Yes, go ahead.
Thanks for the time this evening. I'm Devin Loker. I'm representing Royal Web LLC over at the old Great Lakes Aquaculture, or Great Lakes Shipping Company building, the restaurant there. We have been looking at doing a micro business and wanted to talk about doing a Class A micro business. This micro business license was created by rule about a year ago in March. It allows for 300 plants cultivation instead of the 150. It wouldn't require any change to the floor plan that we've already been approved for. It would just be a different way of growing the plants spacing wise. It also allows for the purchase of concentrates and infused products, processed products from licensed processors instead of making them on site. They'll forego processing on site, which, you know, from a consumer safety perspective, alleviates all of the hazardous components of that business model from being near this. So that's helpful. It's also costly. We've seen very few micro businesses as they were get up and running in the state. This was created to try to alleviate that and give them a better opportunity to compete in this market. So I really appreciate you guys looking at this and working on it. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Is there anyone else in the chambers who'd like to take advantage of this public comment period for Committee of the Whole? Seeing no one, Deputy City Manager Chamberlain, has anybody called in to make a public comment?
We'll go ahead and check right now. We do not.
Thank you, DCM Chamberlain. I appreciate that. We are now down to the work of our Committee of the Whole meeting. Manager Ritzma.
Thank you, Mayor. I would like to have our Deputy Community Planning Economic Development Director, Christina Anderson, come forward, and she's going to provide a zoning update, specifically around commercial zoning. Christina?
Juritzma, Commissioners, Mayor Anderson. I am here tonight to give a brief presentation on the work that we're commencing for the Commercial Zoning Code update. As you know, we have been slowly working on the zoning code for a long time. This will be the first really big chunk, one of two big chunks that we hope to get done this year. So what I'm going to talk about tonight are these three things. One, I'm going to talk briefly about amending the zoning code, what that means, how we do it, how we have been doing it. I'm going to talk at a high level about the changes that we're proposing, and then I'm going to talk about the outreach process that we'll be working on to speak with the community, business owners, property owners, prior to bringing anything forward for official approval. So, just a little bit kind of grounding ourselves in this, because I'm not sure that all the commissioners have had the opportunity to go through a city-led zoning change like this. So whenever we do a zoning change, it goes to both the Plan Commission as well as the City Commission. Of course, it's an ordinance, so you see it in two steps. First reading and scheduling of the public hearing, and of course the public hearing and the opportunity for action. But prior to that, before it goes to Plan Commission, zoning changes require notice, right? So when we are just changing the text of the zoning code, which is part of what we're doing through this project, we notice it in the Gazette. That is what the state requires us to do. And of course, we run our own outreach process to talk about those changes with the community. When you're changing a map, when you're changing the zoning map, whether you're an individual coming before you for development who's changing the map, or the city's coming to change the map, there are some required notice activities that have to occur, specifically that property owners and occupants need to be noticed, as well as when you're doing clusters of parcels that are small, so 10 or less, you also notice all the property owners within 300 feet so they're aware of what's going on. I'll talk about this in a little bit, but we're going to be sending out not the state official notice, but in the coming weeks, we're going to be sending a notice with information about public meetings, what changes are being made, and all of those things to property owners and tenants in all the properties that are going to see a change in the coming months, now to get them oriented to the process. And then, of course, we'll do notice before any public hearings. So we've started this work. Right after Imagine Kalamazoo, we started updating the zoning code, and we did it I'm changing on one screen and not the other, I apologize. After Imagine Kalamazoo, we started updating our zoning ordinance slowly. We have a zoning code that is in Appendix A of our municipal code of ordinances. This code was written in 2005. It has seen a few updates since then. And after Imagine Kalamazoo, which has led to our master plan, we started a bigger update process, because the zoning code is meant to align with the goals of the master plan. And so we have a new master plan. It was time to start to update the zoning code accordingly. And we, so far, have done it in small chunks, often associated with neighborhood plans. So after doing neighborhood plans in the north side neighborhood and the east side neighborhood, we created the live-work zoning districts and the neighborhood node zoning districts. We updated our parking requirements to make sure that we are being mindful of the space that was being used on site for parking lots and impervious coverage, and to think about parking on our small lots, especially in these urban neighborhoods. We created the natural features protection rules, both phase 1 and 2. And those, again, were responding directly to the master plan that talked about setting standards to preserve natural features in Kalamazoo, and the master plan talked about that both as zoning changes as well as the creation of the community sustainability plan, which has also been done since then. We updated the downtown zoning districts right at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic back in 2020. We've done cannabis changes twice, both medical and adult use. And we've done some tweaks. You know, often cities think of zoning documents as these big behemoths that are static, that once you get them out there, you don't really change them. You just kind of go around them through various processes. We in Kalamazoo have started a process where we review the zoning code. We keep track of things that were hard to apply, things that applicants or residents didn't understand, things that received a lot of variance requests, to make sure that we're keeping track of a running list of potential edits. And we did one decent round of edits last year to the code, and I would expect us to do that every couple of years as we apply the document. So what we're talking about tonight, as I mentioned, is a pretty big chunk. What you have on your right, or will have on your right, is the table of contents of the zoning code. I think it's on your right. Left, thank you. On your left are the table of contents of the zoning code in Chapter 50 as it exists today, because what I didn't say in the last slide is that we have Appendix A, and we've slowly been moving it over to Chapter 50 to have a fresh, clean document with all of our new standards in it. This is the table of contents for Chapter 50. Anything that is in blue with this update is going to see some minor changes, right? Those are sections that are already in the code, but we're adding either new information or bringing over more information from Appendix A. And the three items that are in green at the bottom, landscape screening, signage, and lighting, are going to be new sections added to Chapter 50. Those already exist in Appendix A. We're going to be reviewing them, making sure they're up to date, and putting them into the new code. So as you can see, it's a lot of information, which is why I'm coming tonight to start to talk about it as we embark on this process. Working with the City Attorney's Office, we found that this pretty big update of the zoning code related to commercial is also going to require us to do some updates in our municipal code of ordinances on sections that aren't necessarily zoning related. Things like the nuisance ordinance, which is Chapter 21. There are items that are currently in Appendix A in the zoning code where we have found, working with the City Attorney's Office, that that's not where they belong and may be better housed in the nuisance ordinance. And so those items will move there. There are regulations in the Animal Code of Ordinances, which is Chapter 7, I believe, of the Municipal Code, that are better suited in the zoning code because they talk about setbacks from property lines for how you keep rabbit hutches or chickens. And so that's really a zoning standard, so moving that to the zoning code. And then we'll be updating two municipal sections that have to do with sign construction and the posting of bills or posters in public places. Again, this was an opportunity, again, working with the City Attorney's Office. If we're updating our sign code, we should update all pieces that relate to installation and use of signage in the city. So we're taking the opportunity to update those sections of the municipal code. Lastly, we'll be bringing forward to you an ordinance to either repeal fully or significantly alter the downtown and southtown design review guidelines. These were done separate from the zoning code. We created design guidelines. They are over downtown, and when we did the downtown zoning a couple years ago, we said we needed to repeal those because we created new standards in the zoning code that cover a lot of the issues that are in the design guidelines, which have to do with facades and entrance locations and those type of details. And so now we have a duplicate layer of standards in those areas. As we look at outside of downtown, and we expect to apply some of those form-based standards in some of those other locations, we also won't need the Southtown design guideline standards for the very same reason. They become duplicative, and you have, again, two layers. You have design guidelines with a different board, and you have a zoning code with set standards. And so we want to make sure that we're being very efficient in our development standards, and we don't need both. This means that when this comes to you this summer, there'll be multiple ordinances. And again, I'll come to you before then to make sure that I'm walking you through everything. It'll be a map change and a text amendment change in the zoning code. We'll have 4 separate ordinances for those 4 municipal code pieces, and then the design guideline piece. So it's important that we always ground our work in the master plan and the strategic vision. And so what you have here in front of you are a couple of the strategic vision goals, as well as some language from the master plan that guide our work when we update zoning ordinances. So the master plan itself very specifically called out for staff to update the zoning code and to make sure that we're thinking about it in terms of land use and transportation, working together in harmony to create those neighborhoods, those commercial centers, the downtown, those places that the community envisioned. The strategic vision lays out 10 goals, of which I think 5 are particularly important to the work that we're doing with the zoning code update. So the first is good governance. And so this means making sure that we have, as it relates to this project, making sure that our zoning code is clear, making sure that we can apply it fairly and evenly on all parcels in the city to make sure that it's easily understood and it supports our development process, which we want to be open to everyone, whether you're the most seasoned developer or this is your first time. Complete neighborhoods, we talk about this goal a lot, and so making sure that our neighborhoods have not only housing options for the community, as well as places to meet daily needs, being able to think about accessing work and how we allocate those zoning districts accordingly. The connected city goal, which for the zoning code, really focuses on tying land use and transportation together. We already do that in our Chapter 50 zoning code. We'll be making some updates to that, which I'll talk about in just a second, to make sure that our streets and our land uses are working together and not against each other. Economic vitality, of course, we are looking at updating the commercial zoning code. Right? We want to make sure that we are allowing a wide number of businesses in our community and in the right locations to make sure that they are successful for the community and for those business owners. And of course, environmental responsibility. Through this process, we're going to be updating the landscape code. We have the opportunity to think about those landscape standards and making sure that they align with the natural features protection ordinance where appropriate, as well as with the community sustainability plan, which calls out for things like making sure that we have a tree canopy coverage of a sufficient amount across the whole city, thinking about using native species when important. And so we want to make sure that this zoning work aligns with all of those things and those policies and plans. So I'm going to talk briefly now about some of the changes that we're going to make. I'm not going to go into detail because that would be a lot for this evening. But let's talk about the map first. There's approximately 2,000 parcels that are going to be included in this zoning change. So what does that mean? These are parcels that are either currently zoned commercial, but a district that we are phasing out for a different district, for one of our new districts. It could be properties that are zoned manufacturing, but should be on a commercial corridor and should be commercial. And we have places that are zoned commercial today, but are actually residential. And we have found this in previous zoning updates, that sometimes we took a broad brush when we did the 2005 zoning map, and we pulled the zoning districts down a street instead of on the main corridor. And so, that is included in those 2,000 parcels to look at what's residential and what is commercial. I mentioned connected city and that tie between land use and transportation. We already have street types. We use those in our zoning code right now to help regulate some uses, to help regulate the intensity of some of our uses, again, to kind of make sure that our streets and our buildings are matching, working together. In 21, we updated our street types through our street design manual work, but those were not updated in the zoning code at that time. So now we have the opportunity to update those street types into our zoning code. So changing the definitions out from the old ones to the new ones, and making sure that our standards align with what is in the street design manual, which is the document that guides, our street work, our site plan work, and has for about a year. So we're just catching up to that. Not terribly exciting, but these are things that need to be updated. Obviously, our definitions get updated from time to time, including for cannabis or marijuana. The state has made some changes to their rules, as you recently heard from a public speaker, and so some of our definitions are being updated accordingly and working with the city attorney's office. We also are taking this opportunity to move some standards from Appendix A into the zoning code that govern non-conforming uses. And so what is a non-conforming use? It is a use or a structure or a parcel that exists but doesn't match with the zoning standards that exist in that moment, right? So they were built or laid out at an earlier time under earlier standards. And so how do you handle those, right? If they don't match, what are the rules that apply to those parcels to make sure that they can still be used, within guidelines? And so those standards will be brought over from Appendix A into Chapter 50 during this round. Zoning districts. Again, we're focusing on commercial. Right now, we have a lot of commercial zoning districts in Appendix A. Some of them aren't even mapped. They just exist as text only in our zoning code. And so we're going to be, we've gone through the districts, and we're working on a proposal to remove a certain number of districts. And what districts are we removing? I appreciate on the screen in front of you, they're written as acronyms. I'll tell you all what they are right now. It would just have been a lot on the screen. So we currently have 2 commercial office districts. These are districts that really focus on only permitting office uses. We have commercial office and commercial neighborhood office. The neighborhood office one is not mapped. It just exists as text. And the commercial office is just mapped in a couple locations. We have commercial neighborhood 1 and 2, of which 2 is not mapped. And again, commercial neighborhood is a fairly narrowly written district that regulates the size of businesses as well as the use in a very narrow way. We've been moving towards something that is a bit broader in its standards, understanding that sometimes arbitrary numbers don't always work in the real world when you're thinking about business size and building size, especially in a built-out community. Commercial mixed use and residential mixed use are 2 existing districts that are both mixed-use districts. We have other mixed-use districts, including Livework 1 and Livework 2, that we'll replace those with. And we have a series of overlays that are going to go away: a historic preservation overlay, a traditional neighborhood overlay, and neighborhood conservation overlay. All of these have standards, require plans, but they don't exist on the map. They're just things that we created because we thought that we would use them over time and have not. And so, judging by that lack of use, we've determined that we don't need to keep those in our code any longer. The one overlay district that I do want to talk about for a second is the Riverfront Overlay District. This is something newer that some of you might recall. I believe it was done around 2012, 2015, and it created a set of standards in the east end of the north side neighborhood. And I should pause for a second. An overlay district. What's an overlay district? We have every property in the city is mapped with a zoning district, say CO, commercial office. An overlay district would sit on top of that base district and give additional rules and regulations. And so that's the difference between an overlay and a base district. And so what I'm talking about is the Riverfront Overlay District, which sits on top of a very large area on the east side of the east end of the north side neighborhood. These rules have resulted in a lot of variance requests, the Riverfront Overlay. They have caused some difficult conversations with potential property owners and have steered people away from being interested in developing in that area because of some of the challenges that this overlay district, some of the standards that they have. And so staff is going to propose that we remove those standards and those overlay districts from the map accordingly, based on what we've been working with the community on since their inception. I mentioned we're going to be adding a couple districts. Their names are Community Commercial 2 and Commercial Node. And we're going to be pulling over some districts from Appendix A that we're going to keep, like institutional campus. You recently approved the campus master plan for Kalamazoo College. That was tied to this district. We're going to move that over to Chapter 50, and a planned unit development district that we will keep and move over to Chapter 50. So no changes there. I said I'm not going to get in the weeds, and I'm not going to, but I just want to say, as we've created our 2 new districts, we've really started to think about the places that commercial is mapped and should be mapped in the city. And we've started to look at how that relates to the street types and how it relates to parcel size and intensity of an area and access to adjacent residential. And so I pulled these 2 areas because I think they show a nice contrast between scale of development. And so on one hand, you have the stadium corridor. So mostly large lots, although there are certainly smaller lots on Stadium Drive, which is a pretty intensive community connector street. Residential development may back up to these lots, but they don't access it, right? They're actually a completely different grade level. And so there's not a lot of relationship there. There's not a lot of walking in that area. You take that, and it's right by the expressway, right by 131 and Drake Road, which is another large community connector. You take that type of development and compare it to West Nedge, south of Cork, where you have a lot of residential streets that tee into West Nedge. So you see people walking down the street to access commercial, to catch the bus, to walk to school. Those lots generally are much smaller. The residential behind them is lower scale and lower intensity. And those two areas are different, but currently they're mapped the same in terms of the zoning code and have the same standards. So the same 6-story height allowed, the same, lot coverage when you think about parking lots and buildings covering a lot, even though those areas are different. And so part of the work that we've been doing is to, pause and explore what we've mapped where and how that relates to the space that it's in, to make sure that we're creating standards to set the community up for success. The zoning code sets standards for scale, right, size, setback, where the building is in relationship to the property lines. The other major thing that the zoning code does is set the permitted list of uses. Because we're changing districts, collapsing districts, creating new ones, we need to update the use table. And so that is what this slide is representing. I mentioned that we're going to be updating the animal ordinance to take the regulations for rabbit hutches and chicken coops and putting them into the zoning code, because those are regulated by setbacks, which is a zoning issue. And we're going to be updating it, updating the use section to include micro-business Class A licenses. And you just heard from a previous speaker a little bit about that, but it is a new license type from the state. And so we're going to be specifically calling that out in the zoning code. Very similar to the one the micro-business that's already in the zoning code. We're going to be updating parking, landscape screening. Landscape screening has to do with fencing and using landscape to screen between uses, how you landscape around a parking lot, for example. Again, we're going to align this with the Natural Features Protection Ordinance. We're aligning this with the Community Sustainability Plan, which calls out some goals. Whenever we update a section and bring it over to Chapter 50, it's our goal to edit, streamline, try and make the language as clear as possible for all users. Parking and loading standards already exist in Chapter 50, but we are exploring the opportunity to adjust how we set the standards for parking. Traditionally, you use parking minimums. In other words, we don't care what you do as long as you have a minimum amount of parking. A lot of cities are exploring the option that says, actually, I think we do care because you're using up land for parking, which could be put to a different use and has environmental consequences. We're going to think about a maximum and say, maybe we don't care what you do below the maximum, but you can't go above the maximum. And so it's a tool that cities are beginning to use, including several cities in Michigan, big and small. So we're exploring how to use that in this update. We'll be updating the sign code to think about all the different sign types that we have, and we'll be updating lighting. I do not expect there to be a lot of changes to the lighting section when we move it from Appendix A to Chapter 50, but it's been a while since it's been looked at, so a little bit of cleanup, and then it'll be brought over. Outreach. So this is a lot. It's a lot for staff, it's a lot for you who are familiar with this topic, and so it's going to be a lot for the community, and so we're going to need to take some time to talk about these proposed changes and to understand what might need to shift through a community conversation as we move forward. So we have created a draft, right? Draft changes. We've created a draft map. And so we'll be taking those out to the community to consult with them, to understand if we have gone in the right direction and where things need to go from here, again, prior to any formal approval level. We will be, of course, using Imagine Kalamazoo as our clearinghouse for information, where meetings will be located, copies of recordings of presentations and those type of things. I mentioned that we're going to be sending a postcard to the approximately 2,000 parcels that are going to, are currently proposed in the zoning map to have their designation changed, their zoning designation changed, so we're going to be alerting them. That postcard will let folks know when we're going to have meetings, how you might be able to set office hours, not owners, office hours with me to have one-on-one conversations about their own property so they understand what the proposed change could mean and what it looks like, and ask questions, ask as many questions as they have on a one-on-one setting. And we'll be doing some large meetings, and so the postcard will talk about that. Of course, how to get information in languages other than English, and how to request an accommodation for a meeting, whether it be the one-on-one or the full in-person meeting, so they can make sure that they can attend fully and provide their comments or ask their questions. That postcard should be going out within the next week and a half. All this information will be up online. The zoning map changes, for those of you that were familiar with the Natural Features Protection Phase 2. If you remember, we had a zoning map online where the Natural Features Protection was mapped, and you could use your cursor and kind of roll over your parcel, and it would say, you have these features, and that's why you're being proposed for the Natural Features Protection Overlay. In this case, we'll have, here's what you're mapped today, here's what you're proposed, and a little note about why the change is being proposed. So people will have that information from the start. So again, March, we'll be going live with the changes. We'll start office hours as soon as we can. We know KPS spring break is coming up, and a lot of people tend to check out during that time with their families. So we'll pick up in April and have more office hours and set our meetings. And then late spring, early summer, we hope to have this in front of the Plan Commission and this body for public hearings and discussion and approval. While all of this is going on, we are also starting research on the residential zoning code update, which we hope to bring to you before the end of the year. It is a significantly larger quantity of parcels because most of the city is zoned residential. And so right now we are working with some consultants to understand things like parcel size, scale of development, types of units, and get some of that base information so we have that, are then able to start to have conversations with the community and look towards changes. So that is in the works right now, and again, hope to start that public process before the end of the summer, bringing it to you hopefully before the end of the year. I know that's a lot of information, and it's not always very exciting. There's not a lot of pictures, but I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about this. And I, again, am always available to have conversations. I like talking about zoning, even if everybody else doesn't. Happy to have conversations with you on the details.
Thank you, Christine Anderson. I appreciate it. Questions from the commission? Commissioner Decker.
Thank you, Mayor. I don't have per se a question, just more of a comment. You guys have been working on updating this zoning for quite some time, and I think we can see some of the good things that are coming from that, especially now since we're updating the commercial code. This is, as you said, economic vitality. This is going to be able to attract more businesses in certain areas within the city, whether it be downtown or anywhere else that someone would like to open a business. And in my eyes, that also brings in more jobs for our community, more good paying jobs depending on the type of business that it is. Excuse me. And again, really, when you talk about, the riverfront area and the north side area, I appreciate you guys really taking a look at how certain barriers are affecting that area and trying to update those and correct those so all of our neighborhoods can thrive. So I appreciate the hard work that you guys are doing on this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Decker. Commissioner Pradel.
You just knew.
Yes.
Sorry. Did have a couple of questions. Just wanted to get your thoughts on something. I know this is all really important work, and I'm excited to get into this later this year. there were kind of two takeaways that happened in the last year that just kind of caused me pause whenever there's something that has too much omnibus things in one thing. So last summer, you remember the ordinance package, if you will, and I think part of the challenge with that, with the community, was that there was so much packed into one action that it made it even hard to like dissect the pieces and rationalize why you did those things. And then there was a vote that we had that was probably about a year ago. It was the one time that I can remember where we actually had to say, time out, we're going to vote on this. And I think it was when there were just a bunch of text amendments. Do you remember that?
I think so, yeah.
And the same deal, because it's just, like, wow, there's a lot of stuff here. And I guess my question is like, are there any takeaways that you garner from those two experiences that we can learn from when we're tackling this? Whether it be maybe voting them on smaller pieces, or, maybe not having one just like, big action night, kind of thing, but rather, over a couple meetings, or, just wondering if you have any thoughts or like learnings that you have thought about from those two experiences.
Sure. We have definitely taken mostly smaller bite-sized pieces, although the downtown was pretty big, natural features protection was pretty big, but they were focused, right? Zoning is always going to be complicated, and we actually already are doing something different than most cities by taking it in smaller chunks. Usually it's, one giant, here's the 500-page document and your map. That said, the lessons learned that we have had over the last couple of years are, things like pausing to have multiple conversations, starting with high-level conversations like this, having multiple more detailed conversations, particularly at the Plan Commission level. So the Plan Commission has asked staff, when they bring one of these changes forward, to make sure that we're doing multiple presentations to them prior to any action night, whether they're taking it in pieces or all at once. And so in February, I had to think what month we're in. In February, I did this presentation, something very similar to them for that high-level conversation. At their April meeting, we do not have any formal cases being brought by the community, so we'll be spending that meeting going over the details of the code and what's changing. Obviously, in this public setting, it'll be aired on YouTube as well as Facebook, and we'll be able to record that and have it online for people to hear and get those pieces. And that's something the Plan Commission really requested too, is to understand, so they're prepared when the community comes at the public hearing with questions, right? They've had the opportunity to read it and sufficient time to read it. And so that is definitely something that we heard from our boards and commissions that we wanted to do, and obviously in a very public setting, so the community can also benefit from that information. When we're talking about people's property and making zoning changes, that is always very sensitive. It's one of the reasons why we've set up we'll be setting up the one-on-one meetings, so people have the opportunity that maybe don't want to come in a big setting and have very specific questions that relate to them, and give them the opportunity to ask that. And then finally, when we bring it forward, we at that point can make decisions on how we want to take the pieces. Absolutely. And hopefully between now and then, staff will have laid it out, and we can figure. And at that point, we'll be able to we'll all kind of be on the same page as how what needs to be split, or can it be together, and what does that look like, and be at that point together.
I think one of the tricky things too about when you have that large of a thing is if somebody gets held up on one tiny piece of it, then that's all that it's about too.
Correct.
And then you lose the impact of all the other things that you did too. So I mean, that's just a thought, but I was curious what your thinking was on that too, but thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Prado. Commissioner Hess.
Thank you, Christina, for that presentation, and thank you for you and your staff for doing this very important work. This will be one of those first readings and then adoption. So we'll have a first reading at commission where we'll be able to go through these things. So maybe we don't have those things at the end for the before we make the vote.
Potentially. I also have the opportunity to come to another committee of the whole meeting, if that is of interest. As we get a little closer to make those presentations, we could do a special meeting, depending on everyone's schedule. I mean, if that is something that helps to discuss it in a public setting. So we can be completely flexible to make sure that zoning, you know, it's one of those things, it can be very dry. You know, you're only interested in it when you run into it, right? And, you know, trying to open a business, trying to build a home or add on to your home. And so we appreciate that and are happy to kind of take whatever path we need to take to get comfortable with making those changes.
Thank you. Just a kind of small question, but you did mention, I want clarification here. You did mention downtown and Southtown.
Sure.
And will you please explain to me and everyone who's listening what Southtown is, and is that a particular neighborhood or a district, and can you help me understand that?
Sure. So I apologize, I don't have the exact dates in front of me, but in the early 2000s, we created a downtown design review district with guidelines. At the time, cities weren't putting those types of facade, entrance, windows, requirements in zoning codes the way we do now. Also, the downtown design guidelines regulate a whole bunch of other things that aren't building related, sidewalk cafes and some of those other details, street lights. Those are guidelines, right? And they are not regulations like what's in a zoning code. So zoning code is thou shall. Design guidelines are you should, and we have this body set up that can review, and you can kind of push and pull the standards because they're guidelines. That's the main difference between those two documents. We created Downtown Design Guidelines and the Downtown Design Review Committee in the early 2000s. It was updated once, and then shortly before I came on board with the city, staff was working on a district which was south of downtown, which encompasses parts of Edison, parts of Vine, and perhaps a little bit of what we consider downtown. And it was coined the Southtown Design District, and it had a set of standards, which actually became the same standards as the Downtown Design Review. So there's just one design guideline booklet, two different areas that refer to it. When we did the downtown, in 2020, when we rezoned downtown, we zoned downtown with districts that were form-based. And I just talked about that a second ago. Those are those type of districts where you start to think about the scale of the building and not just the use, where the entrance is, the amount of transparency, which is the ratio of window to wall space on buildings, on the facades that face, or the building walls that face the street. We included that in the zoning code. And so we had found that the Downtown Design Review Guidelines, a lot of that stuff was being handled elsewhere. So we had incorporated a lot of the building details in the zoning code. We had worked on a cafe standard and parklet standards. And so we found that the document itself became less useful. We had trouble keeping a committee because they were hardly used. Through those discussions in 2020, drastically reduced what we keep in the Downtown Design Review Guideline, but weren't design guidelines, but didn't make the change at the time because we were still debating internally if we wanted anything at all, any sort of design guidelines at all, or if we just wanted to keep the bare minimum. So we need to make that decision and act accordingly. As it relates to the Southtown Design District, it's the same thing. We are looking at applying some of those form-based districts, especially on our walkable corridors like Portage, Burdick, and other places just south of downtown, which again makes those design guidelines as it relates to building development just a duplicative layer of standards. And so we are trying to streamline everything to make sure that our development process is clear and works for everybody. And when you overregulate, sometimes, or you have multiple layers of regulations, you run into difficulties. And so that's the consideration as it relates to the design guidelines. It was, again, a process we started with the downtown, didn't finish. COVID, we got downtown done, and we didn't quite get anything else done. related to the zoning code, and so now we're coming back because we've been existing in that world with double regulations, and it's confusing. It's confusing to staff, it's confusing to developers, and so we need to make sure we're clearing that up.
Thank you, Commissioner Hess. I think just to follow up on that question before I start into some questions I have, just because we all recognize there has been confusion, we're using this Southtown terminology here, and there's been confusion, then is there a Southtown neighborhood? In fact, people have suggested to us that there is indeed, and we created that Southtown neighborhood. So I think maybe that's part of that question is, what's the difference between what we're calling Southtown and then saying there's not a Southtown neighborhood, you know, relative to that discussion, I guess, so.
Sure, so Southtown is not one of the 22 neighborhoods listed on our neighborhood map. It was created, again, around 2012 as a design guideline district and spans the areas that I just mentioned.
Helpful. Okay, if you will bear with me here just a little bit, I just want to back up just a little, maybe, not just a little bit, maybe a couple steps. And I don't want these questions to be too complicated, but I just want to kind of start from the beginning here, because it's we very quickly, when you're talking about this or when it's happening to you, you know, you're into the weeds of zoning, right? So I just want to go right back up to the top. You know, what's the purpose of zoning? Because I would suggest that outside of the budget, that's probably one of the most significant things we do that in some ways you don't talk about much. I mean, it just happens. So what's the purpose of zoning and what's the power of zoning, I guess?
Sure, I appreciate that question and often start my zoning presentations, did not tonight, with what is zoning and what does it do? And would certainly do that when we go out into the community to make sure we're grounding ourselves in that world. And you are right that zoning touches probably everything that we do, at least at that ground level. And by that I mean zoning is at the most base level. It dictates the standards for the intensity and the use of a lot, right? The scale, how buildings get developed, where they go in relationship to each other, where they go in relationship to the street, how they are used. Those are the things that zoning regulates. How they're used to create an active place, right? By thinking about buildings and streets, you know, together forming an area. When the zoning is not right, when that base level of information is not right, and you find that your property cannot be used the way it's being used now, or that it is providing a set of restrictions that doesn't allow you to change to a different business, even though it might be similar to the one that's there now, or, you know, within reason. You run into a wall from day one when you are doing a project, whether it's adding a bedroom onto your home, building a new home, or opening a new business. And so zoning is critical because doing any type of development project, whether it's your own, again, for your home or something, a business or large scale, big commercial user or industrial user, if the zoning isn't right, none of the other stuff that we do matters because they're not going to get past the zoning, right? If we require an onerous process for people to get special permission to move around things because we've written the regulations so tight, if we haven't written them in a way that aligns with the master plan and with the community vision for the area, then everything is a no-go without coming to a body or multiple bodies for permission from day one. And so you want to make sure that zoning fits with the community, fits with the community needs and where the vision is going. And so this ties to everything that Antonio and Sherilyn, you know, talk about with community investment and housing. Again, it's that base layer. I often show a picture of a building broken into its stories, kind of floating on top of each other, and the basement is zoning, right? Because, you know, zoning is one piece of the puzzle. You want that to be right, or everything above it is going to be a struggle. Just because you have the zoning right doesn't mean everything above it falls into place, right? That's why we also have community investment and our housing team who come in to help guide people through the development process, to help think about supporting housing projects with dollars, and thinking about land acquisition and all of those types of things. So super important, but not a light switch. I tend to say it's not Field of Dreams, right? But you want to make sure that it's right.
So a somewhat more ephemeral question, and maybe one that you could use one example. So we do have community values that we talk about. And how does something that stands as a value end up appearing in something like a zoning code? How does it manifest in the zoning code?
Sure. I mean, I think we think about it as it ties to our strategic vision and the goals and values that we lay out there. Everything those 5 goals that I mentioned, you can look at each one of those, and I mentioned some pieces when I talked about those and how they relate to the zoning code. How are we thinking about, let's say, complete neighborhood? How do we think about making sure that we have housing choices that are available for everybody? We value housing. We want to make sure that there's opportunity for different housing types at different price points everywhere in the city. How does that relate to zoning? We need to make sure that when we look at zoning across all of our neighborhoods, that we are allowing a wide variety of housing types to be built and developed. If you think about valuing economic vitality and our businesses, wanting to make sure that anyone in the city who wants to open a business, be a business owner, how do we think about what the zoning code allows? And so you've heard Antonio come and talk to you previously about micro businesses and the businesses that are out of someone's home. Those are home occupations. Those are allowed by the zoning code. So again, it's that kind of base layer that you don't think about until you run into it, but it really is tied to just about anything physical that happens in our community, one way or another.
Okay. Hey, one thing that always is, so under the Home Rule City Act, we have great power. That is one thing we have not entire control over, but a great deal of control within the boundaries of the city over our zoning here. However, if you want some adjustment to that zoning requirement, you go to our Zoning Board of Appeals and ask for that, correct? Mm-hmm. You don't come to the City Commission. And in addition, if the Zoning Board of Appeals does not grant your appeal, for example, you cannot come to the City Commission and ask us to overturn that. So actually there is a separate statutory authority there as it relates to the Zoning Board of Appeals. How do those two things exist, where at one hand we have authority over zoning, and then on the other hand, we as elected officials ultimately, in those cases, don't have authority over zoning?
So when you think about zoning and the appeals process or the variance process, the power that we have is to make sure the zoning code is right as possible, right? Which means that it fits the lot structure, block structure, the scale, the community, that we've been thoughtful in what uses we have allowed where, the types of buildings and the scale of the buildings that we have allowed. And while there's no such thing as a perfect code, there's also no such thing as every lot being perfectly cookie cutter, matching every requirement. There's always going to be some number of variances that exist out there. Lot is very shallow, there's some slope to deal with, or other, hardship issues. Our powers in getting the code right, which then ideally would limit the number of variance requests that are brought forward outside of the ones that are truly unique hardships. And so our power lies in that world, right? The state enabling legislation, which sets up the Zoning Board of Appeals, which is exactly what it sounds. It's the place where residents, property owners, applicants can go to request relief from the standards. So requesting a standard that's different than what's in the code. The state sets out very specific requirements that they're supposed to meet. And that process is out there, and I'm sure Attorney Robinson can tell you more, but that's out there to set up almost a neutral process, right? That's what the Zoning Board of Appeals body is charged to do. They're to look objectively at the request based on the standards, and not necessarily have the political body go through and look at those relief requests. And so that's why that's separate. If the Zoning Board of Appeals turns you down, your course of action is the courts. There's a second body that is over the zoning code, and that's the Plan Commission. A lot of the things that go to the Plan Commission come to you as well, anything that's ordinance related, because the enabling legislation gave this body and that body that power to think about zoning and the zoning map.
Okay, appreciate it. Hey, you talked about 2,000 parcels being involved in this next change here. Does that mean on the notification side that everyone that is owns property within 300 feet of all 2,000 of those parcels will be notified?
No. So the state enabling legislation allows, actually says there are not those notice requirements when you're zoning more than 10 parcels at a time. And that's thinking about when cities update large portion of their zoning codes, they could be dealing with tens of thousands of hundreds of parcels, right? And so, or, you know, some fraction of that, but still a large number. So the state enabling legislation relieves cities of doing that notice when there are large clusters of parcels. However, as a city, we have always done notice to property owners and occupants if your property is involved in a zoning change. So regardless of what the state says, that's been our policy, at least since I've been city planner. When we do these scattered site changes, we have the kind of added complexity is that we have some changes that are on for zoning. For example, we might have a whole corridor that's being changed, right? Those parcels are contiguous across the street counts as being contiguous. And so there you have more than the 10 parcels or 11 parcels that relieves the notice. In other places, and you'll see this if you look at the zoning map, the existing zoning map now, we have random commercial parcels all over the place that exist in ones and twos. In those cases, we will be following the state rules, which say noticing property owners and applicants, like we do everywhere, and 300 feet. So in some places, you get both. It is a lot of notice. It is definitely a lot of notice that will go out, but, you know, that's the way it works, right? And that's important to get that piece of paper in folks' hands so they know when those public hearings are.
Thank you. I'll try to not ask too many more questions, but so what is our master plan update schedule, and how does that concurrent or not with our zoning
Sure.
changes?
So we will be kicking off the Master Plan 2035, Imagine Kalamazoo 2035. We'll be kicking that off in January of '24. We expect it to be a 24-25 process, you know, 2-year process, just like we did before, because for us in Kalamazoo, the conversation and that outreach is the most critical part of that process. And almost more so than the resulting document. We want to make sure that we have all the conversations, so we're leaving ample time for that. So why are we updating the zoning code still is where you're going. So, and I get that, that's a great question. When you look at Imagine Kalamazoo 2025, a lot of what is in that document are the nuts and bolts of city work. Right? It is a lot of the basic focusing on the building blocks and getting those core services and those details right. Zoning being one. So we are finishing up that work tied to that plan. We will start our conversation for 2035 early, right? A master plan's life is supposed to be 10 years, right? In many cases, communities kind of look at it and say, oh, I think it's good, let's give it another 10, right? Ours will be 7 years old, right? Because we started it, or 8 years old, because we started it, or we approved it in October 17th of 2017. We'll be starting from that point in our conversation for 2035. Based on that and where we've been in the conversations that we've had, I expect us to start from that base layer. I'm expecting that we will have the conversations we'll start from that base layer and think about what's next. What else do we need to do now that we have that basic stuff right and done? If we have a conversation that changes that, then it changes that, and we will work and make those changes accordingly. But I wouldn't expect it to be the same level of overhaul that we needed from 2015, because the last master plan we found wasn't working, the one from 2010, and our zoning code was from 2005. So we had really gone a while before updating the zoning code. So again, it's not a completely static document. We will go through the process and make adjustments as we need to, but that is kind of the big difference between what I think IK 25 and IK 35 and where those conversations start, and where they might lead. That's how I view the difference.
Thank you, Christine Anderson. I don't have any other questions. Anything else come to mind for any commissioners here?
So I would
Sorry,
just put
go
a
ahead.
plug in for two things. One, Plan Commission, which is, I believe, April 7th, Thursday, April 7th. That will be streamed live. If anyone wants to sit with Commissioner Pradel at the meeting, you can come and watch. And we'll be doing a deeper dive into zoning and the details of what is being changed. Again, it'll be recorded, so you can always watch it on your own. I know it's riveting. Yeah, so that will be available. So please come to that. And watch Imagine Kalamazoo for information on imaginekalamazoo.com. Projects page will have a zoning page where we list all the meetings and the opportunity for office hours and those kind of things that you can refer constituents to as they come to you with questions. That's going to be the great clearinghouse location of information.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Anything else, Manager Ritzman?
Nothing else, Your Honor?
All right, well, thank you, Christine Anderson, for coming and helping us with that. Always will continue to be a complicated topic, but, you know, worthy of our deep consideration and being thoughtful about getting ourselves ready for all this work here. So I appreciate that very much. Now is the opportunity for commissioner comments for our Committee of the Whole meeting. Does anybody have any comments for the Committee of the Whole? Okay, I don't see any. A reminder that we have our business meeting, our commission business meeting starting at 7 o'clock tonight. There will be another opportunity for public comments at the beginning of that meeting. Once again, the number to call in is 888-382-9556. And then there'll be obviously another opportunity for commissioner comments at that meeting also. Thanks to all who have come to the chambers or watched this online. Appreciate your interest. We are adjourned.